In a town where a woman's worth was measured by the man she married, a pregnant and desperate Amelia Hayes did the unthinkable. She walked into a den of outcasts and bought herself a husband, a broken cowboy named Lucky Sterling, a man no one else wanted. The townsfolk whispered, calling her a fool, a sinner. They saw a desperate woman and a worthless drifter. What they didn't see was the faded photograph hidden in her locket, a picture of her father, standing beside a younger, prouder Luke. They didn't know that this unwanted cowboy was the only man who had ever saved her family, and now, in her darkest hour, she was praying he could do it again. But secrets in the West have a way of getting buried, and sometimes digging them up can be more dangerous than letting them lie. The relentless Texan's son beat down on the dusty streets of Redemption, a town that had long forgotten the meaning of its name. For Amelia Hayes, the heat was a physical manifestation of her own internal turmoil. 8 months pregnant and utterly alone, she felt the weight of every judgmental stare that followed her down the main street. Her late husband, a man who had promised her the world and left her with nothing but a mountain of debt and a child on the way, had been gone for 6 long months, his life claimed by a cattle rustler's bullet. Now, his creditors were circling like vultures, their patience as thin as the worn soles of her shoes. Amelia clutched the small, dwindling pouch of coins in her hand, the last of her meager savings. It wasn't enough to pay off the debts, not even close. It was, however, just enough for a desperate, last-ditch plan that had formed in the sleepless, lonely nights. She was going to buy a husband. The idea had come to her in a feverish dream, a whisper of a solution to a problem that seemed insurmountable. A husband, even in name only, would give her a modicum of protection, a legal shield against the men who sought to take her ranch, the only home she had ever known. And in Redemption, there was only one place to find a man desperate enough to agree to such a proposition: the Last Chance Saloon, a dilapidated watering hole on the edge of town, where the lost and the damned went to drown their sorrows. Pushing open the swinging doors of the saloon, Amelia was met with a wall of noise and the stench of cheap whiskey and unwashed bodies. The air was thick with smoke, and the faces that turned to stare at her were a rogues gallery of hardened criminals, down on their luck prospectors, and men who had long since given up on the promise of a better life. She ignored their leers and their muttered comments, her eyes scanning the dimly lit room for the man she had been told about, the man they called Lucky Sterling. She found him in a shadowy corner, hunched over a table with a half-empty bottle of whiskey, his only companion. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps in his late 20s, with a lean, wiry frame and a face that was all sharp angles and shadowed hollows. His dark hair was matted with sweat and dirt, and a thick, untrimmed beard obscured the lower half of his face. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of a stormy sky, filled with a weariness that seemed to go far beyond his years. He looked like a man who had seen too much and cared too little, a man who had nothing left to lose. He was perfect. Taking a deep breath, Amelia approached his table. "Are you Luke Sterling?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He looked up at her, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Who's asking?" He slurred his voice, a low, gravelly drawl. "My name is Amelia Hayes," she said, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. "I have a proposition for you." A humorless smile touched his lips. "I ain't in the market for what you're selling, lady," he said, turning his attention back to his bottle. I'm not selling anything, Amelia insisted, her desperation making her bold. I'm buying. I need a husband, Mr. Sterling, and I'm willing to pay. That got his attention. He looked at her again, his gaze lingering on her swollen belly. A husband? He repeated, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. What in God's name would a woman like you want with a man like me? I need a name, she explained, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. A legal name on a piece of paper that will keep the vultures at bay. My late husband's creditors are threatening to take my ranch. With a new husband, I can protect my home, my land, for my child. Luke stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He had been in redemption for 6 months, a drifter, with a past he was desperate to outrun. He had taken odd jobs, mucked out stables, and washed dishes, anything to earn enough for a bottle of whiskey to numb the pain of his memories. He had never imagined that his life would take such a strange and unexpected turn. And what do I get out of this arrangement? He finally asked, his voice laced with a cynical edge. A roof over your head, food in your belly, and $100, Amelia replied, placing the pouch of coins on the table. And in return, all you have to do is sign a piece of paper and pretend to be my husband until my child is born, and I can secure my claim to the ranch. After that, you're free to go, no questions asked. It was a crazy, desperate plan, born of a woman's fierce determination to protect her unborn child. But in the wild and unpredictable world of the West, sometimes the craziest plans were the only ones that worked. Luke looked from the pouch of coins to Amelia's face, his gaze softening for a fraction of a second. He saw the desperation in her eyes, the raw fear that she was trying so hard to conceal. He had seen that same look in the eyes of countless men on the battlefield in the moments before they drew their last breath. He didn't know why, but he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose. "All right, Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "You've got yourself a husband." The wedding was a rushed, clandestine affair presided over by a circuit judge with a fondness for the bottle and a willingness to overlook the unconventional nature of the union for a few extra dollars. Amelia and Luke stood side by side, their hands barely touching as they exchanged vows they both knew were a lie. The only witnesses were the saloon's grizzled bartender and a toothless old prospector who had been bribed with a shot of whiskey. As they signed the marriage certificate, Amelia felt a wave of relief wash over her. It was done. She had a husband, a legal shield to protect her from the circling creditors. But as she looked at the man standing beside her, a man whose name she had only just learned, a new set of anxieties began to surface. Who was Luke Sterling? And what secrets was he hiding behind those stormy, world-weary eyes? The first few weeks of their marriage were a strange and awkward dance of avoidance. Luke slept in the barn, a silent, brooding presence who seemed to prefer the company of horses to humans. He was a hard worker, rising before the sun to mend fences, clear fields, and tend to the livestock. He never complained, never asked for anything, and rarely spoke a word. Amelia, for her part, focused on preparing for the arrival of her baby, her days filled with a nervous energy that left her exhausted by nightfall. They shared their meals in a tense, uncomfortable silence, the air thick with unspoken questions. Amelia found herself studying Luke, trying to piece together the puzzle of his past. She noticed the way he always sat, with his back to a wall, his eyes constantly scanning his surroundings. She saw the network of faint, silvery scars that crisscrossed his hands and forearms, the telltale signs of a life lived on the edge. And she saw the way he would sometimes stare off into the distance, his eyes filled with a pain so deep it made her own troubles seem insignificant. One evening, as a storm raged outside, trapping them in the small ranch house, Amelia decided she couldn't bear the silence any longer. She found Luke in the living room, staring into the flames of the fireplace, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in his hand. "You can't keep doing this, Luke," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You can't keep drinking yourself into oblivion every night." He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the fire. "You don't know anything about me," he said, his voice a low growl. "Then tell me," she urged, taking a step closer. "Tell me why you're so determined to destroy yourself." For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind. Then, in a voice raw with emotion, Luke began to speak. He told her of his time as a soldier in the Civil War, of the horrors he had witnessed on the battlefield, the friends he had lost, the blood he had shed. He spoke of the guilt that haunted him, the memories that played over and over in his mind like a never-ending nightmare. As he spoke, Amelia listened, her heart aching for the pain he had endured. She had known her share of loss and heartbreak, but it was nothing compared to the demons that tormented this man. "After the war," he continued, his voice barely a whisper, "I drifted for a while, trying to find a place where I could forget. I ended up in a small town in Kansas working as a ranch hand. That's where I met her." Pause, taking a long pull from the whiskey bottle. "Her name was Clara," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "She was the ranch owner's daughter. We fell in love, planned to get married, but her father, he didn't approve. He thought I wasn't good enough for her. He went on to tell her about the fire, a devastating blaze that had swept through the ranch, trapping Clara in the stables. He had tried to save her, had run into the inferno without a second thought for his own safety. But he had been too late. He had pulled her from the flames, but she had died in his arms. Her last breath, a whispered, 'I love you.'" The story hung in the air between them, a heavy, suffocating weight. Amelia didn't know what to say. There were no words that could comfort a man who had been through so much. So instead, she did the only thing she could think of. She reached out and took his hand, her touch a silent offering of solace and understanding. He looked at her, his stormy eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. For the first time since she had met him, she saw a flicker of the man he might have been before the war, before Clara, before the whiskey had become his only friend. It was in that moment, as the storm raged outside and the fire crackled in the hearth, that Amelia Hayes realized she had done more than just buy a husband. She had stumbled upon a man with a past as scarred and as complicated as her own. And as she looked at the faded photograph in her locket, the one of her father standing beside a younger, prouder Luke Sterling, a shocking, impossible thought began to take root in her mind. Could it be? Could this broken, unwanted cowboy be the same man who had once saved her father's life? The man her father had spoken of with such reverence, the man he had called a hero. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, forming a picture that was both terrifying and strangely hopeful. But as one secret began to unravel, another more dangerous one was about to be revealed, a secret that would threaten to destroy everything Amelia had fought so hard to protect. The revelation that Luke might be the man from her father's stories sent a jolt of electricity through Amelia. She remembered her father, a kind and gentle man, speaking of a young drifter named Luke who had saved him from a band of rustlers years ago. Her father had been deeply impressed by the young man's courage and skill with a gun and had often lamented that he had never had the chance to properly thank him. Could this be the same Luke? The next morning, Amelia found Luke in the barn, mending a broken saddle. The awkward silence that had once defined their interactions had been replaced by a tentative, fragile connection. "Luke," she began, her voice hesitant, "my father, he used to tell me a story about a man named Luke who saved his life. He was a drifter, a skilled gunman. He said he was a hero." Luke's hands stilled, his knuckles white as he gripped the leather. He didn't look at her, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the sudden rigidity of his posture. "Your father was a good man, Amelia," he said, his voice low and strained. "He gave me a job when no one else would." It was a confirmation, but not the one Amelia had expected. He hadn't just saved her father's life, he had known him, worked for him. This new information sent her mind reeling. Why hadn't he said anything? Why had he let her believe he was a complete stranger? "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice a mixture of confusion and hurt. "It wouldn't have changed anything," he said, his voice flat. "The man your father knew, he's gone. He died in a fire in Kansas, along with everything he ever cared about." The finality in his tone sent a chill down her spine. She realized then that the Luke she had married was a ghost, a man haunted by a past he was desperate to escape. But the past had a way of catching up with you, and in a town as small as Redemption, secrets rarely stayed buried for long. Their fragile peace was shattered a few days later with the arrival of a man named Bartholomew Black Bart Thompson, a ruthless land baron with a reputation for getting what he wanted, no matter the cost. He was the main creditor to Amelia's late husband, and he had come to collect. Black Bart was a large, imposing man with a booming voice and a cruel smile. He dismounted from his horse, his spurs jangling on the dusty ground, and swaggered towards Amelia. His eyes filled with a predatory gleam. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "I've come to offer my condolences on your recent bereavement and to discuss the matter of your outstanding debt." "I have a husband now, Mr. Thompson," Amelia said, trying to keep her voice steady. "My affairs are in order." Black Bart's eyes narrowed, his gaze flicking to Luke, who had emerged from the barn, his face a mask of cold indifference. "This is your husband," he sneered, looking Luke up and down with disdain. "This drifter, he's my husband," Amelia repeated, her voice firm. "And this is my land. You have no claim here." A dark chuckle rumbled in Black Bart's chest. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice turning menacing. "I have ways of getting what I'm owed, and I assure you, Mrs. Hayes, I will have this ranch one way or another." With that, he turned and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a palpable sense of dread in his wake. The threat was clear. Black Bart would not be easily deterred. He was a man who played by his own rules, a man who would not hesitate to use violence and intimidation to achieve his goals. That night, as Amelia lay in bed, her hand resting on her swollen belly, a new fear began to take root. She had bought a husband to protect her from her husband's creditors, but she had inadvertently painted a target on Luke's back. Black Bart was not a man to be trifled with, and she had a sinking feeling that he would not rest until he had driven Luke from her side and claimed the ranch for himself. The next few days were filled with a tense, anxious silence. Every passing rider, every unfamiliar sound sent a jolt of fear through Amelia. She watched Luke as he went about his chores, his movements more guarded than ever, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He was a man on high alert. a soldier preparing for battle. The attack came at dusk, just as the last rays of sunlight were fading from the sky. 3 of Black Bart's hired guns, their faces obscured by bandanas, rode onto the ranch, their guns drawn. "This is a message from Mr. Thompson," one of them shouted, his voice rough and menacing. "This land belongs to him. You have until sunrise to pack your bags and get out." Luke didn't hesitate. He pushed Amelia into the house, his voice a low, urgent command. "Stay inside and don't come out no matter what you hear." He grabbed the rifle he kept propped against the wall and stepped out onto the porch, his face a grim, determined mask. The years of guilt and self-destruction seemed to melt away, replaced by the steely resolve of a man who had been pushed too far. The ensuing gunfight was a blur of smoke fire and the deafening roar of gunfire. Amelia, huddled in the house, listened in terror, her heart pounding in her chest. She prayed for Luke's safety, for the safety of her unborn child, for an end to the violence that had shattered their fragile peace. When the shooting finally stopped, an eerie silence descended upon the ranch. Amelia, her heart in her throat, crept to the window and peered outside. 2 of Black Bart's men lay dead in the dirt, their bodies twisted and still. The 3rd was crawling away, a trail of blood in his wake. And then she saw him. Luke was leaning against the porch railing, his rifle still in his hand, his body trembling with the aftershocks of the fight. He was alive. He was hurt, but he was alive. She rushed to his side, her relief so overwhelming it brought tears to her eyes. He had a gash on his forehead and a bullet graze on his arm, but he was alive. As she tended to his wounds, a profound sense of gratitude washed over her. This broken, unwanted cowboy, this man she had bought for $100, had just saved her life, had protected her home, had defended her honor. He was a hero, just as her father had said. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw not triumph, but a deep, haunting sadness. The violence had brought back the ghosts of his past, the memories of the war, the faces of the men he had killed. He had won the battle, but she feared he was losing the war within himself. And as the sun set on the blood-soaked ground of the ranch, Amelia knew that their troubles were far from over. Black Bart would be back, and he would be seeking revenge. The shadow of the past had fallen upon them, and she feared that it would not be long before it consumed them both. The failed attack on the ranch only served to fuel Black Bart's rage. He was not a man who took kindly to being defied, especially by a woman, and a no-account drifter. He put a bounty on Luke's head, a handsome sum, that attracted a motley crew of bounty hunters, gunslingers, and desperate men looking to make a quick buck. Redemption, once a town of quiet desperation, was now a tinderbox of suspicion and greed. Men who had once tipped their hats to Amelia now looked at her with a mixture of pity and contempt. They saw her as the cause of the trouble, the woman who had brought a storm of violence down upon their town. The pressure was mounting, and Amelia could feel it in the air, in the whispers that followed her down the street, in the cold, hard stares of the townsfolk. She was an outcast, a pariah, and her only ally was a man who was slowly being consumed by his own demons. Luke had become even more withdrawn since the gunfight. The violence had reawakened the ghosts of his past, and he was once again seeking solace in the bottom of a whiskey bottle. He would spend his nights in the barn, his days in a haze of alcohol and self-loathing. Amelia tried to reach him, to break through the wall of pain he had built around himself. She reminded him of his bravery, of the man he had been before the war, the man her father had admired. but her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. He was lost in a world of his own, making a world of guilt and regret. One evening, as she sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the distant mountains, a lone rider approached the ranch. It was the town's sheriff, a weary, world-worn man named Elias Thorne. He had been a friend of Amelia's father, and he had always looked out for her, but he was a man of the law, and the law was not on her side. "Amelia," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "you can't keep living like this. This man, this Luke Sterling, he's a magnet for trouble. The bounty on his head is attracting the worst kind of scum. It's only a matter of time before someone gets hurt, or worse." "He protected me, Elias," Amelia said, her voice filled with a quiet determination. "He saved my life." "I know," the sheriff said, his voice softening. "But he's a dangerous man, Amelia. He's got a past, a dark one. I did some checking. He's wanted in Kansas for the death of a woman named Clara, the daughter of a powerful rancher." Amelia's heart skipped a beat. She had known, Clara had known, that her death had been the catalyst for Luke's downward spiral, but she had never imagined that he was wanted for her murder. "It was an accident," she said, her voice a desperate plea. "A fire. He tried to save her." "That may be," the sheriff said, his expression grim. "But the law doesn't see it that way. Her father has powerful friends, and he wants Luke's head on a platter. If he's found here, he'll be hanged, and you'll be charged as an accessory." The sheriff's words were a cold, hard dose of reality. She had been so focused on protecting her ranch that she had failed to see the bigger picture. She had put Luke in an impossible position, had made him a target for every bounty hunter in the territory. That night, as the weight of her decision pressed down on her, Amelia went to the barn to find Luke. He was sitting on a bale of hay, a bottle of whiskey in his hand, his eyes red-rimmed and unfocused. "Luke," she said, her voice trembling, "you have to leave. You have to go now before it's too late." He looked at her, his expression a mixture of confusion and anger. "Leave?" he slurred. "You're kicking me out. After everything I've done for you." "I'm trying to save your life," she said, her voice breaking. "The sheriff was here. They know about Kansas, about Clara. They're going to hang you, Luke, and I can't let that happen." She told him about the bounty, about the danger he was in, about the impossible choice she had been forced to make. As she spoke, the fog of his drunkenness seemed to clear, replaced by a dawning realization of the truth in her words. He had been so consumed by his own pain that he had failed to see the danger he had put her in. He had been so lost in the past that he had forgotten how to live in the present. He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at her, his stormy eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and regret. "You're right," he said, his voice raspy with emotion. "I should have left a long time ago." He turned to go, but Amelia stopped him, her hand on his arm. "Wait," she said, her voice a whisper. "Before you go, there's something you should know." She reached into her locket and pulled out the faded photograph of her father and a younger, prouder Luke Sterling. She handed it to him, her eyes filled with tears. He looked at the photograph, his hand trembling as he traced the outline of his own face, the face of a man he no longer recognized. He looked at the man standing beside him, a man he had respected, a man who had shown him kindness when he had needed it most. "Your father was a good man," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He deserved better than a drunk and a coward for a son-in-law." "You're not a coward, Luke," Amelia said, her voice firm. "You're a hero. You saved my life, just like you saved my father's, and now it's my turn to save yours." She pressed a small pouch of money into his hand, the last of her savings. "It's not much," she said, "but it's enough to get you started somewhere new, somewhere safe." He looked at her, his heart aching with a pain that was sharper than any bullet wound. He had come to redemption, a broken man, a man with nothing to lose, and now he was leaving with something he had never expected to find: a reason to live. He turned to go, but then he paused, his back to her. "Amelia," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "thank you." And then he was gone, disappearing into the darkness of the night, leaving Amelia alone once more, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and a profound aching sadness. She had saved him, but in doing so, she had lost the only man who had ever truly seen her, the only man who had ever made her feel safe. Luke's departure left a void in Amelia's life that was as vast and empty as the Texas plains. The ranch, once a symbol of her independence and determination, now felt like a prison. The silence was deafening, broken only by the whispers of the wind and the anxious beating of her own heart. She had sent Luke away to save him, but in doing so, she had left herself vulnerable, exposed to the predatory intentions of Black Bart. As she had feared, it wasn't long before he made his move. He arrived at the ranch at dawn, flanked by a dozen of his hired guns, his face a mask of triumphant cruelty. He had come to claim his prize. "It seems your husband has flown the coop," he sneered, his eyes raking over Amelia's pregnant form with a repulsive familiarity. "A wise decision. He was no match for me." "Get off my land, Thompson," Amelia said, her voice trembling but defiant. She stood on the porch, her hand resting on her swollen belly, a lone, defiant figure against the rising sun. "This is my land now," he said, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "I have the deed signed and sealed. Your late husband was a fool, and you, my dear, are the price of his folly." He produced a document from his coat pocket, a deed of ownership that had been forged with a meticulous attention to detail. It was a lie, a fabrication, but in a town where power was measured by the number of guns you had at your disposal, it was a lie that held the weight of truth. Despair washed over Amelia. She had fought so hard, had sacrificed so much, only to lose everything in the end. She was alone, defenseless, and at the mercy of a man who had none. As Black Bart's men began to ransack the house, a sense of righteous fury ignited within her. She would not let this man win. She would not let him desecrate the memory of her father, the legacy she was trying to build for her child. She ran back into the house, grabbing the old rusty rifle her father had kept hidden in the attic. It was a long shot, a desperate, foolish act, but it was the only weapon she had left. She emerged onto the porch, the rifle in her hands, her eyes blazing with a fierce, protective fire. "Get out of my house!" she screamed, her voice raw with a mother's rage. Black Bart laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed across the yard. "You're a feisty one, I'll give you that," he said, his eyes glinting with a dangerous amusement. "But you're no match for me." He raised his own gun, taking aim at Amelia's heart. "It's a shame it has to end this way," he said, his voice laced with a mock sympathy. "But business is business." As he prepared to pull the trigger, a single gunshot rang out from the distance, a sound that was both familiar and strangely comforting. Black Bart's gun flew from his hand, his face a mask of shock and pain. Amelia looked up to see a lone rider on the ridge, his silhouette framed against the morning sun. It was Luke. He had come back. He rode down into the yard, his face a grim, determined mask, his rifle held steady in his hand. He was no longer the broken, self-destructive man who had left her just days before. He was the man her father had known, the hero she had always believed him to be. "This is between you and me, Thompson," Luke said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Let her go." Black Bart, clutching his wounded hand, stared at Luke with a mixture of disbelief and rage. "You," he spat, his voice filled with venom. "You should have stayed gone." "I'm not going anywhere," Luke said, his eyes never leaving Black Bart's. Not this time. What followed was a brutal, bloody showdown, a final, desperate battle for the soul of redemption. Luke, fueled by a newfound sense of purpose and a fierce desire to protect the woman he had come to love, fought with a skill and a courage that bordered on the superhuman. He moved with the grace and precision of a seasoned warrior, his rifle a blur of motion as he took down Black Bart's men one by one. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the screams of dying men. Amelia, watching from the porch, her heart in her throat, could only pray. She prayed for Luke's safety, for an end to the violence, for a chance at the future she had so desperately craved. In the end, it came down to a final bloody confrontation between Luke and Black Bart. The two men circled each other, their guns drawn, their eyes locked in a deadly embrace. The world seemed to hold its breath as they prepared for the final fatal shot. It was over in a flash of fire and a deafening roar. Black Bart fell to the ground, a look of stunned disbelief on his face, a single perfect hole in his forehead. Luke stood over him, his chest heaving, his body trembling with the aftershocks of the fight. He had won. He had faced his demons, had conquered his past, and had emerged from the darkness a changed man. He turned to Amelia, his eyes filled with a love so deep and so profound it took her breath away. He walked towards her, his steps slow and deliberate, and took her in his arms. "It's over," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's finally over." Amelia, her face buried in his chest, wept with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and a love that was as fierce and as untamed as the land they called home. She had bought a husband, a broken, unwanted cowboy, and in doing so, she had found a love she had never thought possible, a hero she had always known was there. The aftermath of the gunfight left a scar on the town of Redemption, a stark reminder of the violence that had almost torn it apart. But it also brought a sense of cleansing, a feeling that the town had been purged of its demons and given a chance to start anew. The death of Black Bart and the dismantling of his corrupt empire brought a wave of relief to the townsfolk. They had been living in fear for so long that they had forgotten what it felt to be free, and they had Amelia and Luke to thank for it. The story of the desperate pregnant woman who had bought a cowboy. No one wanted the woman who had stood up to a tyrant and won, became a local legend. Amelia, once an outcast, was now a symbol of courage and resilience, a woman who had fought for her home, her family, and her honor. And Luke, the man they had once dismissed as a worthless drifter, was now hailed as a hero. He had faced his past, had conquered his demons, and had emerged from the darkness a changed man. The bounty on his head was lifted, his name cleared, and he was finally free to build a new life for himself, a life with Amelia and their child. A few weeks after the showdown, as the first signs of spring began to appear, Amelia gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Samuel after Amelia's father, a tribute to the man who had brought them together, the man whose legacy they would carry on. The ranch, once a place of solitude and despair, was now filled with the sounds of laughter and love. The fields, once barren and neglected, were now green and fertile, a testament to the hard work and dedication of a man who had found a reason to live and a woman who had never given up hope. Sheriff Thorne became a regular visitor, his initial suspicions replaced by a deep respect and admiration for the couple who had brought justice and peace to his town. He would often sit on the porch with Luke, the two men sharing stories and a quiet, comfortable camaraderie. One evening, as the sun set behind the distant mountains, casting a warm golden glow over the ranch, Amelia and Luke sat on the porch, their son sleeping peacefully in a cradle beside them. The air was still and quiet, filled with the gentle sounds of the evening. "I never thought I'd find this again," Luke said, his voice filled with a quiet contentment. "A home, a family, a reason to wake up in the morning." Amelia smiled, her heart filled with a love so deep it felt as if it would burst. "You deserve it, Luke," she said, her voice soft. "You deserve all the happiness in the world." He looked at her, his stormy eyes filled with a love and a gratitude that still took her breath away. "I love you, Amelia," he said, his voice a low, heartfelt whisper. "I love you more than words can say." "I love you too, Luke," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I always have." As they sat there, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky, a sense of peace settled over them. They had been through so much, had faced so many obstacles, but they had overcome them, all their love, a beacon of hope in a world that was often dark and unforgiving. They were two broken souls who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, two people who had been brought together by a secret that had spanned a generation. And as they looked at their son, a symbol of their love and their future, they knew that their story was not just a tale of survival, but a testament to the enduring power of love, redemption, and the unbreakable bonds of family. The Wild West had thrown its worst at them, but they had not only survived, they had thrived. They had built a life for themselves, a life filled with love, laughter, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. And as a new dawn broke over the horizon, they knew that their greatest adventure was just beginning. The seasons turned, bleeding the harshness of summer into the crisp, golden hues of autumn. On the ranch, life settled into a rhythm of comforting domesticity. The bullet holes in the barn walls had been patched, the ghosts of Black Bart's men long since committed to the earth, and the name Luke Sterling was now spoken with respect, not scorn, in the streets of redemption. Luke had found in the simple, repetitive tasks of ranch life a penance and a peace he'd thought forever lost to him. The scent of freshly turned earth, the warmth of a horse's flank, the solid weight of an axe in his hands, these were the anchors that kept him tethered to the present. His greatest anchor, however, was Samuel. The boy was growing quickly, his dark hair a reflection of his father's, but his eyes held the same steady, determined light as his mother's. Watching Luke hold his son, his large, scarred hands so gentle, Amelia's heart would swell, with a love that felt as vast and boundless as the Texas sky. The broken man she had bought in the Last Chance saloon was gone. In his place was a husband and a father, a man whose quiet strength was the foundation of her world. The nightmares that once sent him reaching for a bottle had been replaced by the soft, sleepy cries of their infant son, a sound Luke would rise to soothe without a moment's hesitation. This fragile peace was shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. A fine carriage, the likes of which hadn't been seen in redemption, since the railroad baron passed through years ago, rolled down the main street, and stopped before the sheriff's office. It was drawn by two magnificent black horses, their coats gleaming like polished obsidian. From it stepped a man who seemed entirely out of place in the dusty Texas town. He was tall and lean, dressed in a tailored, black suit of expensive wool, his silver hair impeccably combed. His face was a mask of stern, aristocratic grief, and his eyes, a piercing, icy blue, missed nothing. Sheriff Thorne watched him from his office window, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. This was not a man who had lost his way. This was a man who had come looking for something or someone. The man introduced himself as Alistair Finch, a name that meant nothing to Thorne, until the man added, "I've come from Kansas. I'm looking for a man named Luke Sterling. I was told he resides in this area." The blood ran cold in Thorne's veins. He knew the name. It was the name of the powerful rancher from Kansas, the father of the girl who had died in the fire, the father who had put a price on Luke's head. Thorne rode out to the ranch immediately, his horse kicking up a frantic cloud of dust. He found Luke mending a fence near the road, Samuel sleeping soundly in a basket in the shade of a large oak tree. Amelia was on the porch sorting beans into a bowl. The scene was so peaceful, so idyllic, that Thorne felt a pang of guilt for the storm he was about to unleash. "Luke, Amelia," he called out, his voice grim. "We have a problem." He told them about the visitor, about the fine carriage, and the cold, determined eyes of Alistair Finch. Amelia's hand flew to her mouth, the bowl of beans falling from her lap and scattering across the wooden planks of the porch. Luke went still, the hammer dropping from his hand into the tall grass. The ghost, he thought he had finally laid to rest, had crossed 3 states to find him. "What does he want?" Luke asked, his voice low and strained, the old haunted look flickering back into his eyes. "He didn't say," Thorne admitted. "But he's not a bounty hunter, Luke. He's something far more dangerous. He's a father with a bottomless purse and a heart full of vengeance. Be careful." They didn't have to wait long. The next morning, as the sun climbed into the sky, the black carriage made its slow, deliberate way up the path to their ranch. It stopped a respectful distance from the house. Alistair Finch stepped out, his posture rigid, his face unreadable. He did not come with hired guns. He came alone, armed only with the terrible weight of his sorrow and conviction. Luke met him in the yard, Amelia standing on the porch behind him, her arms wrapped protectively around herself. She would not hide. She would stand with her husband. "Mr. Finch," Luke said, his voice steady despite the turmoil raging within him. "Sterling," Finch replied, his voice cold and sharp as breaking glass. His icy gaze swept over Luke, then flickered to Amelia, and finally to the small, empty cradle that sat near the door. "I see you've moved on, found yourself a new life, a new family. Did you ever spare a thought for the family you destroyed?" "There hasn't been a day I haven't thought of her," Luke said, his voice raw with a pain that was still fresh, still agonizing. "There hasn't been a day I haven't wished it was me who died in that fire." "A convenient sentiment," Finch sneered, "but it changes nothing. You took my daughter from me. You seduced her, filled her head with foolish dreams of a life you could never provide. And when she came to her senses, when she was going to leave you, you couldn't bear it. So you took her life." Amelia gasped from the porch. "That's not true." Finch's cold eyes snapped to her. "And who are you, Madam the whore?" He purchased to give his new life a veneer of respectability. A dark, violent rage, the kind Luke hadn't felt in months, surged through him. He took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists. You will not speak to my wife that way. Or what? Finch challenged, his voice dripping with contempt. You'll kill me too. Add a father's murder to the list of your sins. Luke stopped forcing himself to breathe, to push back the red wave of fury. This was what Finch wanted. He wanted to provoke him, to prove that the monster he believed Luke to be was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. I didn't kill your daughter, Luke said, his voice shaking with the effort of his control. I loved her. Love, Finch laughed, a bitter, broken sound. You don't know the meaning of the word. Clara wrote to me the day before the fire. She told me she had made a terrible mistake. She said, you had a darkness in you, a violence you tried to hide. She was afraid of you. She was coming home. He reached into his coat and produced a worn, folded letter. This is her last testament, the last words my child ever wrote, and they were about her fear of you. He held it out, and for a heart-stopping moment, Luke's entire world tilted. Could it be true? Had Clara been afraid of him? Had his own inner demons, the ones he fought every day, been more visible than he'd known? Amelia saw the doubt flicker across his face. She walked down the steps and stood beside him, taking his hand in hers. Her touch was a lifeline, pulling him back from the abyss of his own self-recrimination. My husband is not a murderer, she said, her voice ringing with a conviction that defied Finch's icy certainty. He is a good and honorable man who has been to hell and back. He carries a weight of grief that you cannot possibly comprehend. You see a monster because that is what your own sorrow has made you want to see. Finch's cold facade cracked for a brief second, revealing the raw, bottomless chasm of his pain. He took everything from me. The fire took everything from both of you, Amelia said softly. You are bound, not by hatred, but by a shared loss. Can you not see that, for a long, tense moment, no one spoke? The only sound was the wind, whispering through the trees. Then Finch's expression hardened once more. I did not come here for a debate, madam. And I did not come here for violence, Sterling. Killing you would be too quick a mercy. I came here to see you suffer as I have suffered. I will use every dollar I have, every connection, every bit of influence to dismantle this pathetic little life you've built. I will turn this town against you. I will buy the debt on this ranch. I will see you and your family thrown out onto the plains with nothing. You will know what it is to lose everything. That is my justice. He turned his back, ramrod straight, and walked back to his carriage. The threat hung in the air, heavier and more suffocating than any storm cloud. This was a new kind of war, one that could not be won with a gun. It was a war of wills, of endurance, and it would be fought not on a battlefield of dust and blood, but in the hearts and minds of the people of redemption. As the carriage disappeared down the path, Luke pulled Amelia close, the fragile piece of their new dawn, already a distant fading echo. And so the story of Amelia Hayes and Luke Sterling became a legend in the heart of Texas, a testament to the fact that even in the harshest of lands, hope can blossom in the most unexpected of places. It's a story about courage, redemption, and the secrets that bind us together. It reminds us that sometimes the greatest treasures are found not in gold or silver, but in the love and loyalty of another human being. It shows us that a person's worth is not defined by their past or what others say about them, but by the choices they make and the love they give. If their journey from desperation to devotion touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who loves a story of true grit and unexpected love. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas from the annals of history. What part of their story resonated with you the most? Let us know in the comments below. Your support helps us to keep these incredible stories alive.